Oh my God, Alvin, she gasped, her voice shaky, breathless, as if her lungs could no longer keep up with the intensity of what her body was enduring. Her nails dug deeply into Alvin's broad shoulders, the tips of her fingers trembling as they clung to his skin like lifelines. His body hovered over hers, powerful and commanding, every muscle tensing with restraint as he held back the full force of his desire. The heat of him, the way he filled her, completely, utterly, as though every inch of her was being claimed, made her feel like she was unraveling at the seams. Her body stretched to accommodate him, every nerve igniting as the tension between them built into an all-consuming fire. A guttural sound escaped Alvin's throat, a low, primal groan that sent a shiver down her spine. His hands gripped her thighs with possessive intensity, fingers curling into the soft flesh, holding her firmly in place as his hips began to move with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Each roll of his hips was precise, almost teasing, but the pleasure it created within her was anything but gentle. Patricia could feel her own body trembling beneath him, her pulse racing as she tried to match his pace, her hips instinctively rising to meet each thrust with desperate hunger. The air around them seemed charged, electric, as though the very atmosphere was complicit in their sinful act. Despite the cold, crisp breeze wafting through the open window, her skin burned with feverish heat. Sweat beaded at her temples, sliding down her neck in rivulets, her breath hitching with every movement of Alvin's body. There was something tortuous about the way he remained calm, each thrust controlled and measured, making her wait, drawing out every ounce of pleasure until she thought she would shatter from the exquisite tension. Alvin's voice broke through her haze, deep and seductive, laced with the kind of intimacy that made her toes curl. "Fuck. This weather is so perfect for doing these things with you, sweetheart." He punctuated his words by pulling out of her entirely, leaving her achingly empty for a fleeting second, only to plunge back in with sudden force. Patricia cried out, her body responding instantly, a wave of ecstasy crashing over her as Alvin's hands tightened their grip on her thighs. With each powerful thrust, the delicious friction between them intensified. She could feel him so deep inside her, stretching her in ways that left her breathless, completely at his mercy. The way his chest pressed against her breasts, his lips just inches from her own, created a closeness so intense, so intimate, that it made her dizzy with desire. "You drive me crazy," Alvin whispered, his breath hot against her ear. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against her collarbone before trailing lower, leaving a path of heat in their wake. The sensation was intoxicating, every nerve in her body responding to his touch, to the flick of his tongue over her skin. And then, without warning, his mouth closed over her breast, his tongue swirling around the hardened peak. "Ah," Patricia moaned, her head falling back against the door as a bolt of pleasure shot through her. She could barely comprehend how he managed to maintain the steady rhythm of his hips, thrusting into her with a calculated pace, while still sending her senses into overdrive with his skillful mouth. It was maddening, the way he knew exactly how to unravel her, how to push her right to the edge and hold her there, teetering on the brink of oblivion. "You are so wet," Alvin's voice dropped to a husky whisper, almost a growl, his tone thick with lust. The way he said it, so raw and possessive, sent a wave of heat crashing through her. She wanted to reply, but the words stuck in her throat, her body too overwhelmed by the pleasure he was giving her to form coherent thoughts. His voice, deep and husky with lust, sent shivers down her spine, his breath hot against her skin. The sound of his utterance, combined with the way his body moved against hers, was enough to unravel her completely, leaving her lost in the overwhelming sensation of him. "Yes, because you're so damn good at this. Always making me so wet. Oh, please," she managed to gasp, her breath catching in her throat as she felt him thrust even deeper, hitting a spot inside her that sent sparks of white-hot ecstasy shooting through her limbs. Her fingers clenched tighter around his shoulders, nails biting into his skin as her body quaked with pleasure. The sensation was almost too much, her mind struggling to process the overload of pleasure that coursed through her veins. Alvin's touch, his rhythm, his relentless, measured thrusts. It all felt like too much, and yet, at the same time, it wasn't enough. She craved more, needed more of him, of this intoxicating connection that made her forget everything but the way he felt inside her. Every inch of her skin was on fire, her body alive with the pleasure he gave her. His hands were everywhere, caressing, teasing, driving her to the brink of madness. She couldn't get enough of him, couldn't stop the way her body responded to every touch, every thrust, every whispered word. Alvin's hands moved down her body, one hand sliding along the curve of her waist, the other gripping her hip as he quickened his pace just slightly, his control unwavering. His lips found hers again, and the kiss he gave her was fierce, almost desperate, as though he was as consumed by the fire between them as she was. Their bodies moved together in perfect sync, every thrust sending shockwaves of pleasure through her. Her skin burned under his touch, a slow, simmering heat that spread from the point where their bodies connected, filling every inch of her with desire. His hands roamed her curves, exploring every dip and rise as if he was memorizing her body, making her his in every possible way. "Oh, keep moaning, Pat," Alvin rasped, his voice laced with barely controlled desire. He thrust harder, deeper, hitting her so perfectly that Patricia's eyes flew open in shock, her lips parting in a gasp of pure, unfiltered ecstasy. The way he moved within her was maddeningly perfect, each thrust deep, measured, as if he knew exactly how to push her to the edge without letting her fall. The heat between them was palpable, an unspoken hunger that grew with every touch, every gasp, until she was lost in the depths of his desire. "Yes, that's it, baby, just like that." Alvin's voice was rough, his movements becoming more insistent, more demanding, as he pushed her higher and higher, closer to the edge of pure bliss. Every thrust was a command, every word a plea for her to give in, to let go. The sounds of their bodies coming together filled the room, the soft slap of skin against skin mingling with their ragged breaths and the raw, primal moans that escaped their lips. Patricia could feel herself spiraling, her body tightening, coiling as she was drawn closer and closer to that precipice, her release building with each thrust, each kiss, each desperate gasp. With every slow roll of his hips, she could feel the tension building between them, a delicious pressure that made her pulse race. He was relentless in his pursuit of pleasure, each movement calculated to drive her wild, to push her further toward the edge. Alvin kissed her again, his lips hungry and possessive, as if trying to devour every moan, every breath she offered. His pace remained steady, but the intensity in his movements, in the way he thrust into her with measured precision, sent her over the edge. There was no stopping it, no pulling back from the torrent of pleasure that was about to consume her. Each kiss he pressed to her lips was like a brand, marking her as his, claiming her in a way that left her trembling. She could feel the intensity of his need in every touch, every kiss, the desperation that mirrored her own desire. Every kiss, every touch, felt like a slow burn, a flame that started at her core and spread through her like wildfire. His hands were everywhere, tracing her curves with a reverence that made her feel worshipped and desired, as though she was the only thing that mattered in his world. She clung to him, her nails raking down his back as she felt herself unravel completely, her body shattering under the force of her release. And through it all, Alvin remained relentless, determined, his body pressing into hers with a primal need that mirrored her own. Alvin wasn't just finishing what he started. He was claiming every part of her, body and soul.